She called the cops on my food truck for bringing crime to the neighborhood. 20 minutes later, those same officers were serving her an eviction notice. Turns out the woman who spent 6 months trying to get rid of the dangerous Mexican actually built her dream house on property owned by that exact same Mexican. The irony was so thick you could serve it with tortillas. What would you do if someone who racially targeted you discovered their house sits on your land? Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. My name is Diego Martinez, 43 years old, and I live in Austin, Texas. What started as a small food truck business has grown into a $35 million real estate empire. But this story is about how one racist Karen dug her own financial grave with a shovel made of pure hatred. Everything started 9 months ago on a sunny Texas morning when I decided to develop the 16 acres of prime land my grandfather Hernando left me in Westlake Hills. The property had been in our family since 1952, back when Austin was still a sleepy college town, and land was cheap enough for a Mexican immigrant to buy with cash from his construction business. I'd been planning a luxury housing development on this land for 2 years. Market research showed Westlake Hills was booming with tech money and California refugees willing to pay premium prices for hill country views and good school districts. But before breaking ground, I wanted to test the waters with the local community. That's when I got the idea to bring my abuela's tacos truck to the property. I'd been running this food truck for 5 years, serving my grandmother's authentic Mexican recipes at festivals and construction sites around Austin. The truck was painted bright green and orange with my grandmother's smiling face on the side panel and the words Desde 1952 painted in elegant script, since 1952. The plan was simple: park the truck on my own land, serve the neighborhood, build some goodwill before announcing the development project. Maybe even find some early buyers among the taco customers. The rich folks in Westlake Hills loved authentic Mexican food when it came from trendy downtown restaurants charging $30 for street tacos. Time to see how they'd react to the real thing served from a truck. I should have known better. I should have remembered that wealthy suburbs often prefer their diversity served at a comfortable distance, preferably with valet parking and cloth napkins. The first warning sign came the very first Tuesday morning. I'd parked Abuela's Tacos truck right on the edge of my property, next to the old oak tree where grandfather used to sit and watch the sunset after long days working construction. The smell of carnitas slow cooking in my truck mixed with the scent of Texas wildflowers blooming across the meadow. Perfect peace until I heard the sound of expensive heels clicking across gravel like an approaching storm. Karen Williams appeared around the oak tree wearing a white linen suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and expression of disgust normally reserved for stepping in dog mess. She was tall, blonde, and carried herself with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd spent decades getting her way through sheer intimidation and social pressure. "Excuse me," she announced in that particular tone wealthy women use when addressing service workers they consider beneath them. "You can't park that thing here. This is a residential neighborhood with strict commercial vehicle ordinances." I looked around at my grandfather's land, the wildflowers he'd planted, the fence posts he'd set with his own hands, and felt that familiar tightening in my chest that comes with being told you don't belong somewhere you absolutely belong. "Actually, ma'am," I said, keeping my voice steady and polite, despite wanting to tell this lady exactly where she could park her ordinances. "This is my property. I'm Diego Martinez. I own this land." Karen's perfectly painted mouth dropped open like a fish gasping for air, but only for about 2 seconds before her brain recalibrated to reject information that didn't fit her worldview. "I don't think so," she said, with the certainty of someone who'd never been wrong about anything important in her entire privileged life. The Westlake Hills HOA has very specific guidelines about commercial activities. You'll need to move that truck immediately, or I'll be forced to call the authorities. The way she said authorities made it sound like I was some kind of dangerous criminal instead of a business owner serving lunch on his own property. But I'd learned long ago that arguing with Karens in public usually makes things worse, especially when you're a brown man in Texas. "Ma'am, I have all the proper permits, and this is definitely my property. You're welcome to check the county records if you'd like. In the meantime, can I interest you in some carnitas? My grandmother's recipe has been feeding Austin families for 70 years. I was trying to de-escalate with friendliness and food, the universal peace offering, but Karen was having none of it. Her face went from pale pink to angry red like a thermometer hitting fever level. "Listen carefully," she said, pulling out her phone and pointing it at me like a weapon. I'm documenting this entire interaction. Commercial food service in residential areas violates multiple city codes and HOA covenants. If you don't remove this vehicle within 1 hour, I'll be contacting code enforcement, the health department, and the police. She took photos of my truck, my license plate, even me standing there holding a spatula, creating her evidence collection like she was building a case for federal court. The whole performance was so dramatic it would have been funny if it wasn't so obviously rooted in the assumption that brown man with food truck equals criminal activity. Ma'am, I really think there's been some misunderstanding here. There's no misunderstanding, Karen interrupted, her voice rising to that particular pitch wealthy white women use when they want to sound both victimized and authoritative simultaneously. I know exactly what this is. You people always start with one truck, then it's friends and family, then the whole neighborhood turns into some kind of... She paused, clearly wanting to use words that would get her canceled on social media. Some kind of situation we moved here to avoid. The casual racism was breathtaking in its brazenness. You people. The kind of language that reveals exactly how someone really thinks when they believe they're talking to someone with no power to fight back. I felt my hands clench into fists, but forced myself to stay calm. Getting arrested for assault would only prove her point and give her exactly the ammunition she wanted. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started recording too. For the record, I said clearly, making sure my phone's microphone picked up everything. I'm Diego Martinez, owner of Martinez Development Corporation. This is my property, purchased legally, and I have every right to operate my licensed food truck here. You're welcome to verify this information with the Travis County Clerk's Office. Karen's eyes narrowed when she heard Martinez Development Corporation. She was clearly trying to process how the Mexican man with the food truck could also be a developer with enough money to buy land in Westlake Hills. The cognitive dissonance was almost visible on her face. We'll see about that, she said, but with less certainty than before. She turned and walked back toward the street, her heels clicking against the gravel with slightly less authority than when she'd arrived. I watched her go, noting which house she entered, the massive Mediterranean-style mansion at 2407 Hillview Drive, probably worth $2.5 million based on recent comparable sales in the area. Manicured lawn, circular driveway, 3-car garage, all the markers of serious money and social status. What I didn't know yet was that Karen Williams had just declared war on the wrong Mexican, and in about 6 months, she'd discovered that her dream house was built on land that didn't actually belong to her HOA. But that morning, I was just a guy trying to sell tacos and test market acceptance for a development project. I had no idea that this encounter would eventually cost Karen Williams everything she owned and teach an entire neighborhood about the dangers of assumptions based on race and class. The rest of that first day passed peacefully. I sold tacos to construction workers, landscaping crews, and a few curious neighbors who were drawn by the smell of authentic barbacoa, slow cooking all morning. Most customers were friendly and complimentary. The carnitas were perfect, tender pork, shoulder seasoned with my grandmother's blend of cumin, oregano, and dried chilies. The barbacoa melted in your mouth like butter flavored with smoke and tradition. By closing time at 3 o'clock that afternoon, I'd served about 40 meals and made enough money to cover my costs plus a small profit. More importantly, I'd gotten a feel for the neighborhood dynamics. Most people seemed welcoming enough, though I noticed Karen Williams peering at my truck through her front windows several times throughout the day. That evening, I called my lawyer, Rebecca Santos, to get advice on HOA issues. Rebecca had been handling my real estate transactions for 8 years and knew the ins and outs of Austin area development politics better than anyone. Diego, she said, after I explained the encounter with Karen Williams, you need to be very careful here. HOAs can make life miserable even when you're legally in the right. They have lawyers, money, and political connections. Plus, Westlake Hills is one of the most restrictive communities in the Austin area. But it's my land, Rebecca. I've got the deeds, survey records, everything. I know, but HOAs operate in a legal gray area where they can file complaints, demand hearings, and tie you up in bureaucratic nonsense for years. They're counting on you not having the resources to fight back. The question is, how badly do you want to keep running the food truck versus just developing the property? The answer was that I didn't particularly care about the food truck itself, but I cared deeply about not being pushed around by racist suburbanites who assumed I didn't belong in their neighborhood. My grandfather had bought this land with his own money earned through decades of hard work. I wasn't about to let some HOA Karen decide what I could or couldn't do with my family's property. Rebecca, I want you to research everything about the Westlake Hills HOA. Bylaws, board members, recent legal actions, financial records, everything. If they want to play legal games, let's make sure we understand the rules better than they do. That's when Rebecca said something that would prove prophetic. Diego, when people attack you for racist reasons, they tend to get sloppy with their research. They assume you don't have resources or connections. That overconfidence usually creates opportunities for people who do their homework. The next morning, I parked Abuela's Tacos truck in exactly the same spot and started preparing for another day of serving authentic Mexican food on my own property. The smell of chorizo and onions sizzling in cast iron filled the morning air while coffee percolated in my truck's kitchen. Perfect Texas morning until I heard the now familiar sound of expensive heels clicking across gravel. Karen Williams appeared again, but this time she brought reinforcements. Following behind her were two other middle-aged women wearing the same expression of righteous indignation and carrying identical folders that screamed HOA official business. Mr. Martinez, Karen said, pronouncing my name like it tasted bad in her mouth. These are Sandra Peterson and Michelle Carter from the Westlake Hills Homeowners Association Board. We need to discuss your ongoing violation of community standards and commercial vehicle restrictions. Sandra Peterson stepped forward, a short woman with gray hair and the demeanor of a middle school principal who'd never learned to interact with adults. She opened her folder with ceremonial importance and pulled out what appeared to be several pages of typed complaints. Mr. Martinez, we've received multiple reports about unauthorized commercial activity in violation of Westlake Hills, HOA Covenant Section 15.4, which clearly states that commercial vehicles may not be parked on residential property for more than 2 hours without written permission from the Architectural Review Board. I looked at the document she was showing me, noting the official letterhead and legal language designed to intimidate people unfamiliar with property law. The whole presentation was calculated to make me feel like I was in serious legal trouble and needed to comply immediately to avoid worse consequences. Ladies, I appreciate you taking the time to visit, but I think there's been some confusion. This property isn't part of your HOA. I own this land independently, and it was never incorporated into the Westlake Hills development. That's impossible, Michelle Carter said, with the confidence of someone stating an obvious fact. All property in this area is covered by HOA covenants. We have maps. Maps can be wrong, I said politely. Property ownership is determined by deeds recorded with the county, not by HOA maps. I'd be happy to show you my documentation if that would help clear this up. I pulled out my phone and showed them photos of my deed, survey records, and property tax statements. The documents clearly showed that my 16 acres were separate from the HOA-controlled territory, with boundaries established in 1952, when my grandfather originally purchased the land. The three women studied my phone screen with increasing discomfort, like people realizing they'd made a serious mistake but weren't sure how to back down gracefully. Even if that's true, Karen said, clearly grasping for any argument that would let her maintain control of the situation. This food truck operation still violates city ordinances about commercial activity in residential neighborhoods. Actually, I have all the required permits from the city, Travis County, and the state health department. My truck is properly licensed, insured, and inspected. I'm operating legally on my own property. I showed them my permits on my phone, watching their expressions change from confident authority to confused uncertainty. These were women accustomed to intimidating neighbors with official-sounding threats, but they'd never encountered someone who'd done their legal homework thoroughly. Well, Sandra Peterson said, with the tone of someone trying to salvage authority from a collapsing position, we'll need to verify this information through proper channels. In the meantime, we strongly recommend discontinuing operations until all questions are resolved. The passive-aggressive threat was clear. Even if you're legally right, we can make your life difficult enough that it's easier to just give up and go away. Standard HOA intimidation tactics designed to exhaust people's patience and resources. Ladies, you're welcome to verify anything you want through proper channels. I'll be here serving lunch from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. every weekday, operating under full legal authority on my own property. Y'all have a blessed day now. I turned back to my truck and started chopping onions for the morning prep, effectively dismissing them from my property. The sound of their heels clicking away across gravel was sharp and angry, like the staccato rhythm of a machine gun firing blanks. Through my truck's window, I watched them cluster together near Karen's driveway, phones out, making calls and taking notes like generals planning a military campaign. The War Council was clearly in session, and I was about to discover just how ugly HOA politics could get when wealthy suburbanites decided that a Mexican food truck represented an existential threat to their property values. What I didn't know yet was that Karen Williams was about to make a series of escalating mistakes that would eventually expose not just her own racism, but a whole network of legal and financial irregularities surrounding the Westlake Hills HOA development. Sometimes the best thing your enemies can do is overreach so dramatically that they destroy themselves in the process. That afternoon brought my first taste of bureaucratic warfare, HOA style. At exactly 2:15, just as I was serving barbacoa tacos to a crew of electricians working on a nearby house, Austin Code Enforcement Officer Janet Rodriguez arrived in her official city vehicle. Officer Rodriguez was a middle-aged Latina woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else than investigating complaints about food trucks. She approached my window with the weary expression of someone who'd spent too many years dealing with suburban drama, disguised as legal issues. "Mr. Martinez, I'm Janet Rodriguez with Code Enforcement. We received complaints about unpermitted commercial activity. Can you show me your licenses and permits?" "Absolutely, Officer Rodriguez." I handed her my folder containing permits, licenses, insurance documentation, and property ownership records. "Everything's in order. This is my land and I'm operating under full legal authority." Officer Rodriguez spent 10 minutes reviewing every document, cross-referencing permit numbers on her tablet, and taking photos for her official report. Her thorough professionalism was clearly disappointing the small crowd of HOA supporters who had gathered across the street to watch me get shut down. "Mr. Martinez," she finally said, "all your documentation is in order. Your truck meets health and safety requirements, your permits are current, and you're operating on property you own. I don't see any violations here." The small crowd across the street began whispering among themselves, their expressions shifting from anticipation to confusion. This wasn't the outcome they had expected when Karen Williams told them the Mexican food truck would be shut down for legal violations. However, Officer Rodriguez continued, raising her voice slightly so the crowd could hear. "I do want to document that several residents have expressed concerns about increased traffic, noise levels, and commercial activity in what they consider a purely residential area. While you're not violating any ordinances, you might consider being a good neighbor and working with the community to address their concerns." The diplomatic language was code for, "Please don't make my life more difficult by escalating this into a bigger political issue." Officer Rodriguez was trying to give everyone a face-saving way out of a situation that could easily spiral into media attention and city council involvement. "I understand completely, Officer Rodriguez. I'm always happy to be a good neighbor. If anyone has specific concerns about my operations, I'm available for conversation. I just want to serve good food and contribute positively to the community." That evening, I called Rebecca Santos to update her on the day's events and get advice on next steps. She'd spent the afternoon researching Westlake Hills HOA and discovered some interesting information. "Diego," she said, "I've been digging into this HOA and there are some red flags. The development was built in 2 phases over 8 years, but the property records don't match the HOA boundary maps they filed with the county. It looks like they may have included land in their covenants that was never actually purchased or properly incorporated. What does that mean practically? It means some of the houses in Westlake Hills might be built on land that doesn't legally belong to the HOA, including potentially Karen Williams' house at 2407 Hillview Drive. The implications hit me like lightning. If Karen Williams' house was built on land that didn't belong to the HOA, and if that land happened to be part of my grandfather's original 16-acre purchase, Rebecca, I need you to order a comprehensive survey of my property boundaries and research the original land grants for this entire area. I'm getting a feeling that Karen Williams might have bigger problems than she realizes." That's exactly what I was thinking. "Diego, this could get very interesting very quickly. If houses were built on your property without your permission, we're talking about trespass, conversion, and potentially fraud charges against the developers." The next morning brought escalation that proved Karen Williams had learned nothing from her previous failures with official complaints. At exactly 7:30 a.m., while I was prepping vegetables for the lunch rush, I heard sirens approaching my food truck location. 2 Austin Police Department patrol cars pulled up to my truck, followed by an ambulance and a fire department emergency vehicle. The cavalry had arrived for what was apparently being reported as some kind of serious emergency involving my food truck operation. Officer Marcus Thompson emerged from the first patrol car with the cautious approach of someone expecting trouble, but hoping to find a simple misunderstanding instead. He was a tall black man in his 40s, with the calm professionalism that comes from years of dealing with Austin's unique blend of tech money, old money, and cultural tensions. "Sir, I'm Officer Thompson. We received reports of a possible health emergency related to food service at this location. We need to investigate and may need to shut down operations pending health department inspection." "Health emergency?" "Officer Thompson, I've been serving food from this truck for 5 years without a single health complaint. All my permits and inspections are current. What kind of emergency was reported?" The caller reported multiple customers becoming ill after eating here yesterday, possible food poisoning, requiring medical attention. We're required to investigate all reports of potential public health threats. I felt my stomach drop. False reports of food poisoning were serious business that could shut down a food operation permanently, destroy a reputation, and result in criminal charges if someone actually got sick from contaminated food. This was an escalation beyond HOA complaints into potential business destruction. "Officer Thompson, I served exactly 42 meals yesterday to construction workers and a few neighbors. Every customer seemed satisfied, and I haven't received any complaints. Would you like to see my food safety documentation?" I showed him my health department permits, inspection records, and food handler's certification. Officer Thompson reviewed everything carefully, while the EMTs and fire department personnel waited to see if their services would be needed. "Sir, your documentation looks solid. Can you provide contact information for customers you served yesterday so we can verify whether anyone actually reported illness?" I didn't keep customer contact information for cash sales, but I remembered serving lunch to the electrical crew working on the house at 2412 Hillview Drive. The foreman, Carlos Mendoza, had complimented the carnitas and asked about catering for his crew's company picnic. "Officer Thompson, the biggest group I served was an electrical crew working right there." I pointed to the house where Carlos's truck was already parked for the day. "You could ask them directly whether anyone got sick." Officer Thompson walked over and spent 5 minutes talking with Carlos and his crew. When he returned, his expression had shifted from official concern to barely concealed annoyance. "Mr. Martinez, I spoke with the crew, and they all confirmed the food was excellent and nobody experienced any illness. In fact, they're planning to order lunch from you again today." The EMTs and fire department personnel began packing up their unused equipment, clearly relieved that their morning emergency call had turned out to be another false alarm in a city full of people who use 911 as their personal customer service line. Officer Thompson continued, "Sir, this appears to be a false report, possibly filed maliciously to interfere with your legal business operations. That's a criminal offense if we can prove intent to harm your business through false police reports." I looked across the street where Karen Williams was standing in her front yard, clearly expecting to see my food truck surrounded by yellow tape and shut down by health authorities. Her expression shifted from smug anticipation to shocked disappointment as she watched the emergency vehicles leave without taking any action against my operation. Officer Thompson followed my gaze and nodded slightly. False reports waste public resources and can result in charges against whoever filed them. If you continue receiving harassment through bogus emergency calls, document everything and file a formal complaint. We take false reporting seriously. After Officer Thompson left, I called Rebecca Santos to report this latest escalation. Her reaction was immediate and alarmed. "Diego, this has moved beyond HOA complaints into criminal territory. False reports of food poisoning are felonies in Texas, especially if they're made maliciously to damage a business. You need to start documenting everything for potential criminal charges. I'm already keeping records, but Rebecca, I want you to accelerate the property survey research. If Karen Williams is going to escalate to potential criminal behavior, I want to know exactly what legal position we're in regarding land ownership. I'm on it, but Diego, be very careful. When people start filing false police reports, it means they're desperate, and desperate people do unpredictable things. That afternoon brought a development I should have anticipated. Karen Williams arrived at my food truck at exactly 1 p.m., accompanied by a man in an expensive suit, carrying a briefcase and wearing the particular expression lawyers use when they're about to deliver threats they consider devastating. "Mr. Martinez," Karen announced with renewed confidence. This is Bradley Morrison from Morrison and Associates. He represents the Westlake Hills Homeowners Association in legal matters concerning covenant violations and property disputes. Bradley Morrison stepped forward with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating people through legal complexity and expensive suits. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder that looked official enough to impress judges and terrify ordinary citizens. Mr. Martinez, I represent the Westlake Hills HOA in this matter. My clients have attempted to resolve this issue through reasonable discussion, but you've chosen to continue violating community covenants and city ordinances despite repeated warnings. Mr. Morrison, I've explained to your clients that this property doesn't belong to their HOA, and I'm operating legally under proper permits. I'm happy to show you the same documentation I've provided to city officials. Mr. Martinez, Morrison continued, without acknowledging my response. My clients have instructed me to file for injunctive relief in Travis County District Court to halt your commercial operations, pending resolution of property boundary disputes and covenant violations. Additionally, we're prepared to seek damages for diminished property values and legal costs. The threat was clear. Even if you're legally right, we can tie you up in expensive litigation for years while charging you for our legal costs in the process. Standard lawyer intimidation designed to force compliance through financial exhaustion. Mr. Morrison, I said, keeping my voice calm, despite feeling my blood pressure spike, I welcome any legal proceeding that will establish property boundaries definitively. My attorney will be happy to respond to any filings you submit to the court. I handed him Rebecca Santos's business card, noting his slight change in expression when he read her name. Morrison and Associates was a small suburban firm that specialized in HOA complaints and property disputes. Rebecca Santos was a senior partner at Gutierrez, Santos, and Chen, one of Austin's most respected real estate law firms. The difference in legal firepower was immediately obvious to anyone familiar with local legal hierarchies. Mr. Martinez, Morrison said, his tone shifting from aggressive to merely professional. I hope you understand the seriousness of these proceedings. Legal costs can accumulate quickly when property disputes drag through the courts. Mr. Morrison, I understand completely. I also understand that filing frivolous lawsuits against people operating legally on their own property can result in sanctions and attorney's fees awarded to the defendant. I'm confident that a thorough legal review will resolve all questions about property ownership and legal authority. Morrison closed his briefcase with less ceremony than he had opened it and walked away with Karen Williams trailing behind him, looking less satisfied than she'd appeared when they arrived. The legal intimidation hadn't achieved its intended effect of making me back down immediately. That evening, Rebecca Santos called with news that would change everything about this dispute. "Diego," she said, and I could hear excitement mixed with disbelief in her voice. "You need to sit down for this. I've completed the property survey research and discovered something that's going to blow this HOA situation wide open." "What did you find?" "Karen Williams' house at 2407 Hillview Drive is built entirely on land that belongs to you. The HOA boundary maps filed with the county are wrong. Her property, plus 6 other houses in that development, were built on portions of your grandfather's original 16-acre purchase. The implications hit me like an earthquake. If 7 houses were built on my property without my permission, the legal and financial consequences would be catastrophic for everyone involved. Property ownership disputes of this magnitude could result in forced demolitions, massive lawsuits, and title insurance claims worth millions of dollars. Rebecca, are you absolutely certain about this? I've triple-checked the survey records, original land grants, and county filings. The Westlake Hills Development Company made a surveying error when they plotted the boundaries and accidentally included your property in their development. Karen Williams and 6 of her neighbors are technically trespassing on land they don't own. How is that possible? Don't title companies check these things before approving mortgages? They should. But this looks like a case where everyone relied on the developer's survey maps without independently verifying property boundaries. The title insurance companies are going to be very unhappy when they discover they insured properties that were built on someone else's land. Rebecca, what are my options here? Legally, you have the right to demand removal of all structures built on your property without permission. Practically, that would destroy 7 families and create a legal nightmare involving multiple title insurance companies, banks, and potentially criminal charges against the developers. Or we use this information strategically to resolve the food truck harassment while negotiating a reasonable solution that protects everyone's interests. Karen Williams is in no position to continue filing complaints about your food truck when her entire house is built on your property. The delicious irony was almost overwhelming. Karen Williams had spent months trying to drive me away from my own land, not realizing that her dream house was built on property that belonged to me. The racist who wanted to get rid of the dangerous Mexican was about to discover that her family's entire financial future depended on that exact same Mexican's generosity and legal restraint. The next morning, I parked Abuela's Tacos truck in the same spot and went about my normal routine of preparing for the lunch rush. But now I was operating with the knowledge that the woman trying to destroy my business was technically living on my property without permission. At exactly 10:30 a.m., Karen Williams appeared at my truck with her usual expression of righteous indignation and a new folder full of official-looking documents. She was clearly escalating to whatever her next level of harassment would be. "Mr. Martinez," she announced loudly enough for neighbors to hear, "I have here a formal cease and desist order regarding your ongoing violations of health codes, commercial vehicle restrictions, and community standards. You have 24 hours to remove this truck permanently or face legal action." The cease and desist order was printed on Bradley Morrison's law firm letterhead and contained multiple threats about injunctions, fines, and legal costs. It was designed to look official enough to scare someone unfamiliar with legal procedures into believing they were about to be arrested or sued into bankruptcy. "Karen," I said, using her first name deliberately to establish that our relationship had shifted, "I think you and I need to have a private conversation about property boundaries and legal authority. Would you mind stepping over to my truck window where we can talk privately?" Something in my tone must have communicated that the dynamics of our conflict were about to change dramatically. Karen approached my truck window with less confidence than she'd shown in previous encounters. "Karen," I said quietly, making sure our conversation couldn't be overheard by neighbors who were starting to gather to watch whatever confrontation they thought was about to unfold. "I've had my attorneys research the property boundaries for this area, and we've discovered some information that I think you need to know." "I don't care what your attorneys think they've discovered," Karen said, but with less conviction than usual. "This is HOA property governed by legally binding covenants that—" "Karen," I interrupted gently, "your house is built on my land." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that would eventually burn down everything Karen Williams thought she knew about her legal and financial security. "That's impossible," she said, but her voice had lost its authoritative edge and taken on the uncertain tone of someone who was beginning to suspect that their entire world might be built on mistaken assumptions. "I'm afraid it's not impossible. It's documented fact. Your house at 2407 Hillview Drive is built entirely on property that belongs to me, purchased by my grandfather in 1952 and never sold or transferred to your HOA or the development company." I showed her photos of the survey documents on my phone, watching her face change from confident dismissal to growing alarm as she realized she was looking at official county records that contradicted everything she'd been told about her property ownership. "This has to be some kind of mistake," she said, but now she sounded like someone trying to convince herself rather than state a fact she believed. "It's not a mistake, Karen. The mistake was made by the development company when they plotted boundaries for Westlake Hills. They accidentally included my property in their development and built houses on land they didn't own. Your house, plus 6 others, are technically trespassing on my property." The implications were sinking in now, visible on Karen's face like someone watching their financial security evaporate in real time. If her house was built on property she didn't actually own, her mortgage was secured by property she had no legal right to occupy. Her title insurance would be void, her equity would disappear, her family's entire financial foundation would collapse. What does this mean?" she asked, and for the first time since I'd met her, Karen Williams sounded like a frightened human being rather than an entitled suburban dictator. "It means, Karen, that you're in no position to be filing complaints about my food truck operation. In fact, you're in no position to be demanding anything at all from the person who actually owns the land your house sits on. But we bought this house legally. We have a mortgage, title insurance, everything was approved by banks and title companies. I understand that, and I have no interest in destroying innocent families who bought property in good faith based on incorrect information provided by developers. But I also can't tolerate continued harassment and false police reports about my legal business operations on my own property." The negotiation that followed established new terms for our relationship that reflected the actual legal reality rather than Karen's racist assumptions about who belonged in the neighborhood and who had the power to determine property use. Karen, here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop all harassment related to my food truck. No more HOA complaints, no more false police reports, no more legal threats. In return, I'll work with you and the other affected homeowners to find a reasonable solution that protects everyone's interests. You mean you won't force us to tear down our houses? I mean, I have no interest in destroying families or creating legal chaos that would hurt innocent people. But I also won't tolerate racism disguised as concern about property values or community standards. The transformation in Karen Williams was immediate and dramatic. The entitled suburban tyrant disappeared, replaced by a terrified homeowner who suddenly understood that her family's entire future depended on the mercy of the man she'd spent months trying to destroy. Mr. Martinez, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about you and your business that were wrong and unfair. I hope you can forgive me and that we can work together to resolve this situation. The apology was obviously motivated by self-preservation rather than genuine remorse, but it represented a complete reversal of power dynamics that had defined our relationship up to that point. Karen, apology accepted. Now I need you to make some phone calls, call off Bradley Morrison and his legal threats, contact code enforcement and police to withdraw any pending complaints, and explain to your HOA board that there will be no further interference with my food truck operations. Over the following weeks, Karen Williams transformed from my biggest enemy into my most enthusiastic supporter, recommending Abuela's Tacos to friends and neighbors while working behind the scenes to smooth over the political complications created by her previous harassment campaign. The legal resolution took 6 months to complete, involving surveys, title insurance claims, and negotiations with multiple parties. In the end, I sold the land under the 7 houses to the homeowners at fair market value, providing them with clear title while earning a substantial profit that funded expansion of my food truck business into a full restaurant chain. Karen Williams learned that assumptions based on race and class can be expensive when they're directed at someone who actually has more resources and legal standing than you do. The HOA learned that boundary disputes can be costly when your community is built on someone else's property. And I learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people discover the truth about their own situation. The Westlake Hills development never bothered another food truck operator after word spread about what had happened when they tried to push around Diego Martinez. And Abuela's Tacos became so popular in the neighborhood that I eventually opened a second location right there in the heart of what used to be the most exclusive area in Austin. Today, that original food truck still parks under my grandfather's oak tree every Tuesday and Thursday, serving authentic Mexican food on land that's been in our family for over 70 years. Karen Williams stops by occasionally to buy carnitas tacos and make small talk about weather and neighborhood news, carefully avoiding any topics related to commercial vehicle ordinances or community standards. The lesson, if there is one, is that people who make assumptions based on appearance and accent often discover those assumptions can be very expensive. Karen Williams thought she was dealing with a powerless immigrant she could intimidate through official channels and social pressure. Instead, she found herself completely dependent on the generosity of someone she'd tried to destroy. But the story doesn't end there. 6 months after our initial confrontation, I received a phone call that would reveal just how deep the corruption surrounding the Westlake Hills development actually ran. The caller was Maria Santos, no relation to my attorney Rebecca, who identified herself as an investigative reporter with the Austin American-Statesman. She'd been researching property development irregularities around Austin and discovered the Westlake Hills situation through public records searches. "Mr. Martinez," Maria said, "I'd like to interview you about the property boundary issues with Westlake Hills. But I think there's a much bigger story here that involves multiple developments around Austin and potentially fraudulent land transfers going back 15 years. What kind of fraud are we talking about? I've identified at least 12 developments where boundaries were allegedly surveyed incorrectly, resulting in houses being built on property that didn't belong to the development companies. The pattern suggests systematic fraud rather than accidental surveying errors. The investigation that followed revealed that the same surveying company, Lone Star Property Services, had been involved in all 12 questionable developments. The same company that had surveyed the boundaries for Westlake Hills and somehow missed the fact that they were including my grandfather's 16 acres in their development maps. Further investigation revealed that Lone Star Property Services was owned by the brother-in-law of the Travis County Planning Commissioner, who approved development permits for all 12 projects. The surveying errors weren't accidents. They were part of a coordinated scheme to include valuable property and developments without actually purchasing that land from the legal owners. The scheme worked because most property owners never checked development boundaries carefully enough to notice when their land was included in projects they hadn't authorized. The conspirators counted on absent owners, elderly owners, or owners who didn't speak English well enough to navigate county bureaucracy effectively. They hadn't counted on someone like me, someone with the resources to hire competent attorneys, the education to understand property law, and the determination to fight back against racist assumptions and illegal land grabs. The criminal investigation that followed resulted in federal charges against 17 people, including the Travis County Planning Commissioner, the owner of Lone Star Property Services, 3 development company executives, and 2 title insurance company employees who had processed fraudulent property transfers. Karen Williams found herself caught in the middle of a federal investigation that threatened to expose not just property fraud, but also a pattern of racially motivated harassment designed to drive legitimate property owners away from land that had been illegally included in HOA developments. The federal prosecutors were particularly interested in Karen's harassment campaign against me because it established a pattern of using official channels to intimidate property owners who might challenge development boundaries. Her false police reports, HOA complaints, and legal threats weren't just harassment. They were part of a criminal conspiracy to prevent discovery of large-scale property fraud. During her deposition, Karen was forced to explain why she had assumed I was operating illegally when I had proper permits and owned the property where my food truck was parked. Her inability to provide any rational explanation beyond racial assumptions became part of the federal record documenting discriminatory enforcement of property restrictions. The investigation also revealed that Bradley Morrison's law firm had been filing intimidation lawsuits against multiple property owners who questioned development boundaries around Austin. The pattern showed that legal threats were being used systematically to discourage people from researching property ownership issues that might expose the fraudulent surveying scheme. Bradley Morrison himself faced federal charges for using the legal system to facilitate property fraud and intimidate legitimate property owners. His law license was suspended pending resolution of criminal charges that could result in decades in federal prison. The financial consequences for everyone involved were catastrophic. 12 developments had to be resurveyed at enormous cost. Hundreds of houses were discovered to be built on property that didn't belong to the development companies. Title insurance companies faced claims totaling over $200 million. Banks discovered that mortgages were secured by properties that buyers didn't legally own. For Karen Williams and the other Westlake Hills homeowners built on my property, the legal resolution provided security, but at significant cost. They were able to purchase clear title to their land, but at current market prices rather than the below-market prices they would have paid if the original development had been surveyed correctly. Karen's mortgage payments increased substantially when her loan was recalculated based on the actual value of property she now owned legally. Her property taxes increased because the land was reassessed at fair market value, and her homeowner's insurance premiums increased because title insurance companies now considered the area high risk for property disputes. The woman who had tried to drive me away to protect her property values discovered that her property values were actually enhanced by resolving the legal uncertainty surrounding land ownership. But the financial cost of that resolution eliminated most of the equity she thought she'd built up over 8 years of mortgage payments. Meanwhile, my food truck business expanded into a restaurant chain that now operates in 6 Texas cities. The publicity from the federal investigation created enormous interest in Abuela's Tacos, with customers driving from across Texas to try the food that had started a federal investigation into property fraud. The original Westlake Hills location became so popular that I eventually built a permanent restaurant on the site where my food truck used to park. The restaurant sits under my grandfather's oak tree, serving his granddaughter's authentic Mexican recipes to customers who include several federal judges, the current Travis County Planning Commissioner, and occasionally Karen Williams. Karen never became a friend exactly, but she learned to treat me with the respect due to a neighbor and successful business owner, rather than someone she could intimidate through racist assumptions and abuse of official channels. Her children eat at my restaurant regularly and always say hello politely when they see me around the neighborhood. The federal investigation also led to significant reforms in how Texas handles property development oversight. New requirements for independent boundary verification make it much harder for development companies to include property they don't own in their projects. Stronger penalties for discriminatory enforcement of property restrictions protect legitimate property owners from harassment based on race or national origin. Looking back on the whole experience, I realized that Karen Williams did me an enormous favor by escalating our dispute to the point where it triggered comprehensive legal research into property boundaries. Without her harassment campaign, I might never have discovered that my grandfather's land had been illegally included in the Westlake Hills development. Her racism and determination to drive me away from my own property ultimately resulted in me discovering valuable land that I didn't know I owned, exposing a criminal conspiracy that had defrauded dozens of property owners and building a successful restaurant business on the foundation of authentic Mexican food and Austin's love for underdog stories. The irony is so perfect it could be served with salsa. Karen Williams tried to get rid of the dangerous Mexican who was lowering her property values. Instead, she helped that same Mexican discover that he owned her property, expose the criminals who had defrauded her family, and build a restaurant empire that made him one of the most successful business owners in Austin. Today, when I stand under my grandfather's oak tree and watch families enjoying dinner at Abuela's restaurant, I sometimes think about the assumptions people make based on appearance, accent, and the kind of work someone does for a living. Those assumptions can be costly when they're wrong, especially when they're based on racism rather than facts. I also think about my grandfather Hernando, who bought 16 acres of Texas Hill country with money saved from years of construction work, never imagining that his grandson would one day use that same land to build a business empire while teaching wealthy suburbanites about the dangers of racist assumptions. The land that Karen Williams tried to drive me away from now employs 43 people, serves thousands of customers annually, and generates enough tax revenue to fund improvements throughout the Westlake Hills area. The dangerous Mexican she wanted to eliminate became one of the neighborhood's largest employers and most significant contributors to the local economy. Sometimes the best revenge isn't planning elaborate payback schemes. Sometimes it's just being successful enough, determined enough, and legally informed enough to survive other people's attempts to destroy you. Success, as they say, is the best revenge, especially when it's served with authentic carnitas tacos and a side of property law education. The final twist in this story came exactly 1 year after our original confrontation. Karen Williams approached my restaurant counter on a busy Saturday evening, waited in line like any other customer, and ordered carnitas tacos for her family's dinner. When I handed her the food, she said something I never expected to hear from someone who had spent months trying to destroy my business and drive me out of the neighborhood. "Diego," she said, using my first name for the first time since we'd met, "I want you to know that I learned something important from our situation. I made assumptions about you that were wrong and hurtful, and those assumptions almost cost my family our home. I'm grateful that you chose to resolve things fairly rather than pursuing all your legal rights against us." The apology was genuine this time, motivated by understanding rather than fear. Karen had spent a year dealing with the consequences of her racist assumptions and learned that the man she'd tried to destroy had actually saved her family from much worse consequences that could have resulted from the property fraud scheme. I accepted her apology with the same grace my grandfather had taught me to show to customers, neighbors, and even former enemies who were capable of growth and change. "Karen," I said, "we all make mistakes. What matters is learning from them and treating people with respect going forward. Your family is always welcome here." As she walked away with her dinner, I realized that our conflict had taught both of us valuable lessons. Karen learned that assumptions based on race and class can be expensive, and that the person you try to destroy might be the same person whose mercy you eventually need. I learned that standing up to racism and intimidation, backed by solid legal research and competent attorneys, can not only protect your rights, but create opportunities you never imagined. The oak tree my grandfather planted still shades the restaurant that bears his wife's name. The land he bought with construction workers' wages now supports a business that serves authentic Mexican food to customers from across Texas and beyond. And the woman who once tried to drive us away now brings her grandchildren to eat at our tables under the same tree where this whole story began. That's the thing about property ownership, legal rights, and standing up to bullies. Sometimes the best outcome isn't destroying your enemies. Sometimes it's building something so successful that your enemies become customers, and your success becomes a lesson for everyone about the dangers of racist assumptions and the rewards of legal knowledge combined with authentic Mexican food. Drop a comment and tell me about your own experiences with HOA harassment or property disputes. Have you ever had neighbors make assumptions about you based on your appearance or background? How did you handle it? I read every comment, and your story might inspire others facing similar situations. And if you enjoyed seeing racism backfire spectacularly, while property fraud got exposed by a food truck owner with better lawyers than expected, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We've got more stories about ordinary people who fought back against extraordinary corruption and won bigger than they ever imagined. From all of us at HOA Revenge Stories, thanks for watching today's episode of Karma, served with carnitas tacos, and a side of property law. Sometimes justice tastes better with authentic Mexican seasoning and the sweet flavor of racist assumptions, proving very, very expensive for people who should have known better. Remember, bullies count on their targets not having resources, knowledge, or determination to fight back. But when you combine legal preparation with authentic Mexican food and a grandfather's land purchase from 1952, even the most entitled HOA, Karen, can discover that assumptions are the mother of all expensive mistakes. Until then, remember that property ownership is about more than just deeds and surveys. It's about family legacy, community contribution, and standing up to people who think they can determine who belongs in America based on the color of their skin or the sound of their accent. Sometimes the best way to belong somewhere is to own it outright and serve the best tacos in the neighborhood. Peace, justice, and authentic Mexican food for everyone. We'll see you in the next one.